We're free to think, but there's no freedom in thinking. We think there's freedom in thinking, but there isn't. And this is the reason that we can say that neurotic suffering doesn't come from some sort of malfunction of our thinking, but rather what it comes from is the fact that we think too much, or we think continuously. We don't have any gaps between our thoughts. And when we don't have any gaps between our thoughts, the whole day becomes one big continuum, one thought following another thought, without a space of non-thought. And so that is a situation with no freedom in it. We can understand it by looking at the analogy of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a very good analogy for this business of us trying to think about everything and trying to live life by thinking, via thinking, which is what we do. It's what we're inevitably doing, given the fact that we have put thinking in charge. If we put thinking in charge, then all that we have available to us is what thought has approved. So we're living in a world that thought has approved for us because it has passed the criteria or the standards of thought. So it's got all these official little stamps on it saying approved, approved. We're living in the approved reality that thought says is right or that thought says is true. According to thought's very narrow criteria for working out if stuff is true or real, it's perfectly correct. According to its criteria, what it's saying is correct. It's just that its criteria aren't wholly arbitrary. They're just selected. They're very, very narrow, and they're selected at random. So if you put those two together, so you can see that although thoughts might be functioning accurately in terms of its own understanding, because its own understanding doesn't correspond to reality, that doesn't really count for a lot. So thoughts precision, thoughts rigor, no matter how rigorous we get, no matter how precise we get, we're never going to overcome this difficulty, the difficulty that thoughts criteria for working out what's real and what isn't real are too narrow, they're too concrete, they don't mean anything. But to go back to what I was talking about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a thing we all understand. Our understanding is we kind of know, yeah, we got to have it, I suppose, but it's a pain in the arse, and it keeps on getting to be more of a pain in the arse. And no matter how smart we are as a culture, as a civilization, the one thing we don't seem to be able to do anything about is the proliferation of bureaucracy. What the proliferation of bureaucracy means is the loss of freedom and the loss of creativity, because we know very well that bureaucracy has nothing to do with freedom, because it has to do with regulations and following regulations, having protocols and observing those protocols. And the same thing goes for creativity. Nobody likes it if we start getting creative with the rules, because you're not supposed to get creative with them. Creativity is the very last thing we want to see happen if we are invested in rules, because creativity means doing what we don't expect to do. And if someone's doing what we don't expect them to do, they're obviously not following the rules, so that's no good. So it is not particularly controversial to say that bureaucracy gets rid of our freedom, and it gets rid of our creativity. And so we end up operating in a non-creative, non-free way. And that doesn't do any good to anyone, obviously. What could help us live life is creativity, is the freedom to think about things in different ways, the freedom to see things in different ways. But there is an inexorable process whereby the bureaucracy associated with daily life just has to keep on increasing. Whoever heard of bureaucracy decreasing? I suppose deregulators would say yes, it can be done. But on the whole, as time goes on, we accumulate more and more bureaucratic stipulations. Just like we could say in psychiatry, as time goes on, we get more and more categories for mental health conditions. That's a form of bureaucracy as well. It's a form of bureaucracy because we're trying to cover everything with our fixed ideas and categories. And so we end up having to come up with more ideas and more categories to try and cover everything. But what we end up with is an unwieldy mass of criteria, of rules and regulations. That doesn't help anyone. This is curious because when we think about it, when we're talking about a thing that keeps on increasing no matter what, and if we try hard, we might be able to slow it down a bit, but it has this tendency to increase irreversibly. It's a one-way thing. Once we're there, we can't go back to the freedom we had before. And the human race, we once didn't have very few regulations. Now we have more regulations than you could count, even if you spent your whole life counting them, probably. So the human race, in the course of its evolution, we've invented washing machines and microwaves, and we've also invented bureaucracy, and as a result, none of us are free like we used to be free. And we might think back romantically or nostalgically to those old times where we didn't have so many rules telling us what to do. But we'll never get back there because that's gone. That's how things used to be. And now we just have to put up with all these rules. So the very same parallel exists with us in our individual lives. So we start off as children, we don't run on rules. Kids don't run on rules. Adults like rules, and they like to inform children about their rules and get cross if the children don't obey those rules. That's what being an adult's all about, isn't it? The rules, the rules, the rules. As if sticking to the rules is ever going to achieve anything, apart from ongoing sterility. So then we start off with no rules in our head, which is another way of saying we start off being spontaneous. Spontaneous means having no rules in our head telling us what to do, how to think, or how to see the world. And as time goes on, we very quickly pick them up because all of the adults around us are telling us this is a rule, here's another rule, here's another. They aren't. The funny thing about rules is they're not rules. I.e., they don't exist, they're made up things. But if someone tells you there's a rule and you believe them, then for you there is a rule. And of course, as children, when we're brought up amongst all these rule-loving adults, we totally believe them because they do seem to know what they're doing. Adults do seem to know what they're doing. They have a kind of air that, oh yes, we know what we're doing. It's totally wrong, of course. It's just part of the farce of being a socially adapted adult. You have to go around looking as if you know what it's all about and you know what you're supposed to be doing. You just know all that stuff, and it makes you look It makes you kind of very stuffy and boring and pompous and stupid because it's all a lie. But that's it. That's society. That's what it's all about, really. Losing freedom and somehow trying to turn that into a virtue by saying, "Oh yes, because we have all these rules and stuff that somehow means that we're civilized, or that we're doing things in a good way or efficient way." So what I was kind of getting at was that it is analogous to entropy, and we could say that the increase of bureaucracy is just another way of talking about the second law of thermodynamics, which says that if that's the right law, I think it's the second law, which says that the entropy of a closed system can never diminish. It can either stay the same, maybe, but the tendency is for it to just keep inexorably increasing and increasing. So that means we're going backwards in life. We start off with low entropy as children, i.e. we're not that predictable. We're pretty spontaneous. We end up being super predictable, super non-spontaneous. So that's the entropy increased. That's the entropy of the system, which is reaching maximum levels, because there's no creativity left at all in this game we call being a socially adapted human being. Because the thing about the game of being a socially adapted human being, like all games, is that it is totally defined by rules. You can't play a game without having all the bits of it, all the aspects of it defined by rules. Anything that isn't defined by a rule straight away becomes not part of the game. It's just like saying you can't become creative when playing a game. Everyone's going to say, hang on, playing a game isn't about being creative for the rules. So there's no freedom in the game, and there's no creativity in the game. So there's this big tendency for us to think we're actually moving in the development. We're developing in the sense that as we grow older, we're realizing more of life's potential. We're being more of what we could be. We're realizing our own potential, but that absolutely isn't the case, because in as much as we are socially adapted, we are abiding by the rules of the game. In as much as we are abiding by the rules of the game, we are not free. And it just so happens that when we are totally adapted, that means being totally defined. There's no bit of us, no aspect of us that isn't defined. And actually, well, there is an aspect of us that isn't defined, a very big aspect, but that's not permissible. We can't talk about that at the dinner table. We just have to ignore that and talk about what we can talk about. So it's exactly the same as playing a role. If I am playing a role, then this role has certain characteristics, and I just stick to that. It's been written down what the role is, and I follow down the script for that role. So that is living a pre-scripted or predetermined life. That's what life is like. When we all join together and agree what life shall be, we end up living a parody of life, which is all made up of rules. And a life that is all made up of rules is not a life, but rather a caricature of life. It's a clunking, mechanical approximation of life, which actually turns out to be utterly horrendous if we could only see it. And if we did want to see it, one way that we could try to get some flavour of just how inimicable that rule-based life is, just how wretched it is, by making the thought experiment, just to think, well, what would it be like if I had to only do things that I have cleared or passed or validated myself in advance? So that, in other words, I have to think about everything in advance before I do it. And when I think about it, I think, okay, that's not the good thing to do. That's not good either, and that may end badly. So we select a thing, and then we think, I will do that. We have the idea and then we enact the idea. So that doesn't sound too bad because we kind of think that's how you live life. But the problem is, if we do that, we never ever escape from ourselves. We never ever escape from the limitations of our conditioning, the limitations of our thinking. Because we can only do what we have previously thought of, and thought is a very, very narrow domain. We can't ever go beyond that. And moreover, there is no joy in deliberate living. If I do something deliberate, it's hard work. It's like carrying a heavy stone, or it's like rolling a big boulder up a hill. It doesn't happen by itself. Obviously, mechanical stuff doesn't happen by itself. That's the whole point of mechanical stuff. I have to make it happen. I have to force it to happen. So I just keep on doing that, forcing things to happen. I think I'll do this, and I force myself to do it. It doesn't happen spontaneously. There's no freedom in it. It is mechanical. And if we can just imagine what that would be like, to be like living like that every day, where we can't do anything unless we first tell ourselves to do it and okay ourselves for doing it. See, that is really being a prisoner. We're prisoners of ourselves. We're prisoners of our mind. And that is exactly like living in a bureaucracy, living in an organization which is bound by bureaucracy, as organizations are, and only being able to act according to the protocols. Now, on the face of it, the protocols, the procedures are there to help us. They're there to help the corporation, the organization. It's like supposing something happens. Oh yeah, this is something that never happened before. What should we do? And it's not good enough for every member of that organization just to creatively respond to that situation, because that's not how organizations work. We have to be told, it has to be written down, and once it has been written down, it's law. That's the procedure in that particular case. So we try to work out all the things that could happen that need procedures, and as time goes on we discover more and more situations that we hadn't thought of, so we invent procedures for that as well. And what we end up with is not increased flexibility, because rules don't equal flexibility. We end up with a turgid mass of rules which stifle us and don't allow creative action. And that's our attempt. That is because we don't trust ourselves to act spontaneously, but we want to have a protocol or a template for how we are going to behave in everything. So it can be seen that when we do lack this trust in our own spontaneity, and we do have to have a plan for what we're going to do in every possible circumstance, that might seem smart, but then when we try to do that, we realize that we're not living. We're just enacting some half-baked idea we have about things, and it doesn't even look like we're living. We don't come across as being properly alive. We come across in a clunky, mechanical, robotic kind of a way. So Jung says that rules are a substitute for consciousness, so that if there's no consciousness, we have to have a whole bunch of rules telling us what to do. But it's not a good substitute, because on the one hand, if you look at me when I have no consciousness, but I just have a whole bunch of rules to follow, that even though if you just observe it for a short while, you might think I know what I'm doing. If you observe me over a period of time, you realize that I'm blind. To be following rules is to be blind. There's no consciousness in it. So it's a poor substitute. It's a poor, it's a much more degraded way of being in the world to have rules. If I had consciousness, then I wouldn't need any rules at all, because I'd be conscious, so whatever situation arises, the spontaneous response would arise, but I wouldn't have to have a whole list of spontaneous responses. What shall my spontaneous response to this be? The whole thinking process slows everything down, and it makes it ineffective, and all I can ever do is enact the same channels or the same logical pathways that I ever. And this isn't to say that having a thought here and there is a disaster, or having a procedure written down, but when we try to live life via procedures, when we try to live life via thoughts, then that's where the problem arises. And the problem behind neurotic suffering is this rigidity of always having to have a rule, always having to know what's going on, and be sitting there thinking what is the right thing to do in this situation. And that seems quite reasonable to most of us. If there's some kind of a problem, to sit there and scratch our head and say, what should I do in this situation? But it isn't. Because as soon as we think, we lose freedom. As soon as we think, as soon as I think, all that happens is I end up doing what I've always done before, repeating past patterns. And that doesn't work, because life is different every moment. I heard someone say that on a film yesterday. It's a different ball game every moment. It can change every moment. So rules are never going to catch up with that. Consciousness doesn't need to catch up, because consciousness will be right there with it. But we've neglected the spontaneous aspect of ourselves so much. We have to have a rule for everything, and we have to have experts to tell us, or other influential, important people to tell us. And the result is that we end up living a life with no freedom in it, and we also living a life with no authenticity in it, because there's nothing authentic to me there. That's just rules that I have absorbed. What's authentic to me would be something that no one else has ever done, that I'm doing creatively right now. That would be authentic to me. Anything else is inauthentic and totally lacking in freedom.